So each presenter has 25 minutes with 5 minutes of questions. I will send a chat in the chat window when there's 5 minutes, 3 minutes, or 1 minute. I know some of you can't see that, so yeah, I'll figure something out if it's necessary to jump in. If you scroll up in the chat window and bring that up, I've put in information there on the peer reviews, evaluations, because we have a large number. Look at the 8 people who are ahead of you, and sorry, the 4 people who are ahead of you and the 4 people who are presenting after you in the peer reviews email that Beth has sent you. And then go to the link, evaluation form link, and fill in the evaluations there. And on that note, it is 6 o'clock and we're ready to go. So Brandon, whenever you're ready, I'll start the timer.
Okay, can you hear me, everyone?
Yes, yes.
Okay, then I'll go ahead and start with my, presentation then. So good afternoon, or good morning, or good night, wherever you are in the world. My name is Brandon Green. I'm here to give you a presentation on my capstone proposal, which is to create a refugee and internally displaced person camp population estimate tool derived from automated feature extraction. In today's presentation, I plan on to introduce my problem and proposed solution, as well as provide background on image-based population estimates, to provide a little bit of background on my study area, as well as to state my objective, my project workflow, expected outcomes, as well as the benefits from my perceived benefits from my project and challenges and limitations that I may encounter throughout my project, and then my project outline, timeline, and possible presentation venues. The problem I plan on addressing is that effective management of refugee and internally displaced persons camps rely on accurate, up-to-date, and comprehensive population estimates. These population estimates are used for monitoring efforts, in addition to doing analysis for flood risk, logistical planning, such as healthcare facility location. It's also used for advocacy to collect funding and supplies for these camps. Failure to obtain these accurate population assessments may lead to neglect by the governments housing these camps, as well as the relief agencies and the humanitarian funding mechanisms to help support these camps. And oftentimes these population figures are not available due to limited access to these camps, as they're often located in high conflict zones or closed off areas to humanitarian organizations, as well as some of the population estimates are biased for political purpose. This could either be overestimates to try to get more funding and for these camps, or underestimates when maybe a government's trying to suppress bad publicity that there's large IDP camps within their state. Additionally, there's a difficulty in the collecting data during large influx of persons. And then lastly, the traditional field-based estimates are often timely and resource intensive to collect. So I propose for this project to develop a tool that calculates population estimates based on the area of camp dwellings derived from automated feature extraction methods. So, background on some refugee and internally displaced person statistics worldwide. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Refugee Relief estimates that there are 68.5 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. And these people are often forcibly displaced due to armed conflicts, generalized violence, or human rights violations. And they settle in formal and informal camps throughout the world, to include 40 million people internally displaced, which are people that are settling in camps inside their home countries. Additionally, 25.4 million people are refugees, which are people who settle in camps outside their home countries. And then there's 3.1 million asylum seekers. The traditional method to derive population estimates are field-based methods. These could be derived derived from camp registration processes as well as camp censuses, which can either include the whole camp or just partial census to create these population estimates. Some of the benefits of the field-based approaches is they provide better ground truth. Additionally, they have a better ability to determine dwelling occupancy rates compared to image-based population estimates. However, some of the challenges, as I previously stated, for field-based population estimates are that they are time and resource intensive. They could be biased for political purpose, as well as the safety concerns, as you need to put people in dangerous situations because a lot of these camps are located in high conflict zones. Studies have shown that image-based population estimates are a viable alternative to field-based population estimates. And these image-based population estimates are derived from dwelling figures and population estimate figures. The dwelling figures are derived from high-resolution imagery, and they are either calculated through manual feature extraction, where an analyst manually digitizes refugee and IDP camp structures from remote sense imagery, or automated feature extractions, where an analyst will utilize a computer to extract different features based off of pixels or groups of pixels and their likelihood of occurring within a assigned class probability function. Once the analyst calculates these dwelling figures, there's two different ways they can calculate population estimates. They can either multiply the number of dwellings within the camp by the estimated persons per dwelling, or they can multiply the total dwelling area by the estimated persons per covered area statistics. Studies have shown that there's a lot of benefits of image-based population estimates compared to the field-based approaches. Mainly, one of the main ones is that it's less time and resource intensive. It also significantly decreases safety concerns, as you don't have to deploy people on the ground to get these estimates, because it's all derived from remote sense data, which you can do away from these locations. Additionally, studies have shown that image-based population estimates provide reasonable precision compared to field-based estimates. However, some of the limitations associated with image-based population estimates are that they require highly trained analysts to support both the manual and automated feature extraction methods. They require high resolution imagery, which may be hard to find, which may not actually be available or cost a lot of money. Additionally, compared to field-based population estimates, image-based population estimates have the inability to differentiate building function or occupancy status, which may lead to overestimation. And another main limitation is that the image-based population estimates still rely on accurate field-based population estimates. Without those accurate field-based population estimates, the image-based population estimates may not truly represent the ground truth. Lastly, the precision with image-based population estimates decrease in complex situations. This includes multi-story dwellings, connected dwellings, or dwellings where they have similar spectral signatures as the environment around them. Image-based population estimates are actually a growing trend within the refugee and IDP humanitarian relief missions. The International Organization for Migration, the Norwegian Refugee Council, and UN Refugee Agency actually advocated for image-based population estimates within their camp management toolkit. Additionally, the United Nations and International Organization for Migration are already utilizing imagery to monitor refugee and IDP camps worldwide, to include in Somalia and Haiti. As I mentioned, there's two different extraction methods to get the dwelling information to derive image-based population estimates, and that's manual and automated extraction. Some of the benefits of the manual extraction is that it's human controlled. However, it's very time consuming. It requires highly trained analysts to use image guides to digitize the camps. Additionally, the subjectivity that is associated with manual extraction can lead to inconsistencies in complex situations. Several studies have shown that given the same area, different analysts will extract different information, and those final calculations actually vary pretty drastically, especially in complex situations. Lastly, the manual feature extraction methods can't be automated, which kind of limits their ability to transfer. So automated feature extraction methods, which is the basis that I plan on doing my project around, the benefits of that are that it's scalable, and this is in the sense of the production time. As the camp size doubles, the extraction time only increases based off the processing time of the computer, versus the manual extraction method. If the camp size doubles, the extraction time doubles as well. Automated feature extraction methods are transferable. This can lead them to be more consistent compared to manual, so you don't have that subjectivity as much, as well as it enables them to be automated within tools, which is, as I said, is the basis for my project, is to automate these automated feature extraction methods. Some of the limitations I expect to encounter, which have been identified in previous studies, is that the automated feature extraction methods still require highly trained analysts to develop the signature files as well as the workflow associated with the extraction method. There is a decreased accuracy in complex situations, as well as the spectral variance between sensors, and then the geographical, seasonal, and material effects on spectral signatures can decrease the ability for automated feature extraction methods to be transferable. So that's another limitation that I will encounter throughout my project. Within the automated feature extraction method, there's two main sub-methods, object-based and pixel-based methods. The object-based method, the computer classifies groups of pixels or objects based on their spectral, textual, and spatial properties, whereas the pixel-based method, the computer just classifies each pixel based independent from one another. So the object-based method is often more effective than a pixel-based, especially during using high-resolution imagery, because it's able to incorporate different information to create those signature classes to automate the extraction process. The study area selected for my project is the Rohingya refugee emergency, which is currently happening in Bangladesh. Approximately 671,000 refugees have fled targeted violence in Myanmar since August 2017, joining an already robust refugee population in two areas in Bangladesh, called Palang and Neoparal, where they settled around formal shelters, creating more than 50,000 shelters since 2017. These new shelters mainly consist of bamboo, rope, and tarpans. However, some of the more established camp locations have more uniform structures due to the large presence of the United Nations and other humanitarian relief organizations monitoring these camps, which is one of the reasons why I selected this study area, because it contains both formal structures and complex structures to kind of see if the automated feature extraction, how it handles the two different complexities. Additionally, I chose the study area because the population estimates are well documented, which are needed for image-based population estimates, as well as it provides a baseline to compare my tool to see if this is a viable option for population estimates for refugee and IDP camps. So the project objective is to develop a tool to calculate refugee and IDP camp population estimates based on dwelling figures derived from automated feature extraction methods. To accomplish this objective, I plan on acquiring the data necessary for image-based population estimates. I would then identify the optimal automated feature extraction workflow to develop my tool around, and then I plan on testing and refining the tool to make sure it can calculate these population estimates. Then lastly, I'll create a standard operating procedure document for the tool so I can publish the tool and deliver it to different organizations so they could utilize for refugee and IDP camp monitoring. The first piece of data that I need to create image-based population estimates is acquiring high-resolution imagery. I've identified two sources so far. The International Organization of Migration provides drone imagery of my study area, as well as the commercial satellite company Digital Globe provides Worldview 1, 2, 3, and 4 images of the camp. Both image sources provide high resolution imagery, which is needed for the automated feature extraction approach, with the drone imagery actually providing slightly better spatial resolution. Each source provides multi-band imagery, which is used to help develop the spectral signatures in the automated process, with the Digital Globe information providing an additional band of the shortwave infrared, which will help improve the ability to differentiate different features based off their spectral properties. Each image source is ortho-rectified and collected fairly regularly. However, one of the main differences between the sources are that the drone imagery is free and the Digital Globe imagery actually costs money. Because my project is for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief organizations, which often have limited resources. Free imagery is preferred because it will decrease the cost for them to utilize the tool set for monitoring efforts. And both image sources are available to those different groups, which is a positive. So the second piece of information to derive image-based population estimates is actually having population estimates to determine the average persons per covered area or the average persons per dwelling. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, along with the Refugee Relief and Reparation Commission of the government of Bangladesh, publishes a high confident, regular bi-weekly report on the population estimates at all the different camps located in Bangladesh. So this provides the information needed to derive image-based population estimates for my toolkit, as well as a great baseline data to compare my tool estimations to. And this information is field-based, derived from field-based approaches. So after acquiring the data, I plan on to identify the optimal automated feature extraction workflow using ArcMap 10.5.1. The automated extraction workflow can comprise of different combinations of object or pixel-based approaches using different classifier methods, maximum likelihood, random tree, support vector machine. Additionally, different parameter combinations can be used for the different steps within these workflows. So I plan on conducting multiple combinations of these workflow elements to identify the best workflow to automate the extraction of refugee and IDP camp structures. And so the difference between object-based and the pixel-based workflows is the object-based will segment the image, which is creating those groups of pixels based off the spatial and textual properties of the pixels. And then utilizing training areas, which I will extract based off the classes I identified in table 1, which are different classes identified through visual inspection of the camps. Then I use those training areas to train the different classifiers for both the object-based and pixel-based workflows, which will create a classifier definition file, which I will use to classify the image. After I classify the image, I will conduct an accuracy assessment to determine the user, producer, and overall accuracy of the classification workflow, as well as the kappa coefficient. I would utilize these accuracies to identify the best workflow to automate the extraction of camp structures. If there are similar accuracies between different workflows, I'll utilize the processing time and consistency of the workflows to identify the optimal workflow to develop my tool around. So once I identify that workflow, I will start creating my tool. The tool parameters that I've identified are the image file, which the tool will use to classify and derive the dwelling information. And this image file must correlate with the classifier signature file. A camp outlines an optional parameter that the user can use to create a raster mask to decrease processing time and focus the calculation on the camp area. If the object-based approach is determined to be the best workflow, the tool will enable the user to set the segmentation parameters. However, I will provide the default parameters that I identified as the optimal parameters for the workflow for my study area. The user will be asked to provide a classifier definition file, which the tool will use to classify the image. I will provide the signature file that I derive for my study area, but I will also enable the users to input different classifier definition files to help them use the tool for different sensors because of the variation between sensors, as well as different geographical areas as the signatures of the camp features may change due to geographical effects. The user will input the population estimates, which is the average person per covered area. And then the toolkit will ask for a workspace for all the data to be stored for the calculations. The tool, here's the workflow for the tool. The object-based and pixel-based workflows are pretty similar, except as I mentioned, the object-based workflow requires a segmentation of the image. So after the image is segmented, both workflows will classify the input image usually using the user-defined classifier definition file, which will create a classified raster. Then the toolkit will create a polygon identifying the roof areas within the camps that will be used to calculate the total area, which will be multiplied by the population parameters to derive the image-based population estimates for the camp. The tool would then create 2 reports, one a text-based report, and then one an ARC message, telling the user what the population estimates, as well as documenting all the parameters used to derive those population estimates. Additionally, the user will be provided the polygon, the roof area polygon to use to overlay on the image to visually inspect the tool's ability to identify feature roof areas. To validate my tool, I plan on testing it at least 4 times. I plan on testing it using the same area I used to develop the classified definition file, as well as the same image date. Additionally, I plan on using the tool to derive population estimates for the same camp but a different date and time, as well as using the tool to derive population estimates for a different area, but with the same date as that's the test area, as well, and a different date in a different area. After that, I will calculate the classification accuracies for each of those tests and calculate the average. And hopefully the tool will produce at least a 75% overall classification accuracy, and then a population estimate within a 15% margin of error compared to the field-based population estimate baseline data provided by the United Nations. Here's just a quick overview of my project timeline, developing and comparing the different methodologies and developing the tools, refining it, and actually delivering the tool to a couple of the humanitarian disaster relief organizations I know that operate near me, and collecting their feedback and refining the tool if necessary. Here's a list of possible presentation venues that I'm currently looking at to present my project to. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
I don't know if you can see your chat window. You might have to stop sharing your screen and then bring up the chat window. There's some information.
Yeah, I just opened the chat, so I'm reading that now. So
Okay.
review this article. So I'm reading Delphin, right? Sorry if I mispronounced that. Yeah, that's one of the sources I actually used the studies when I was doing my literary review. So utilizing image-based population estimates is an ongoing trend for the last 10 years. So there's definitely some good stuff out there. A lot of the studies I've noticed have kind of been based in sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East. So that was another reason kind of why I picked Bangladesh, because it's I currently live in Hawaii, so a lot of the relief organizations around me focus on Asia, and there hasn't been too many studies on that. So that was another reason why I was planning on looking at Bangladesh. But thank you for the information on that article. So Justine asked, what are some of the challenges that I anticipate? A couple of the challenges I anticipate are, which have been identified in previous studies, is the decrease of accuracy of automated feature extraction methods in complex situations. So these include areas where there's a lot of tree cover, shadows exist, which can affect the ability for the extraction methods to create those classifier definition files, as well as areas where informal camp areas where there's a lot of connected buildings and tarps and stuff, which may not necessarily be areas where refugees or internally displaced people are staying. So that could lead to overestimation of population estimates. Additionally, as I mentioned, a lot of these informal structures are created from materials that are found just in the local environment. So because of that, the shelter spectral signatures are going to be very similar to the environmental signatures, which also might confuse the classification methods. So that's probably the main challenge I'm anticipating, is just getting the automated feature extraction workflow to within like at least 75% overall accuracy. And hopefully once that workflow is created, the toolkit will actually be more more useful, because it would be able to provide better dwelling information to use to derive the image-based population estimates.
I have a question for you. How will you verify that your numbers are correct? Like that your tool's going to work right?
Good question. So there's two different tests that I'm going to do. I'm going to do accuracy assessment on the actual classification aspect of the test. So I'll run the tool, and then I'll have access to the actual classified raster from the image. I'll do an accuracy assessment based off of image interpretation. So I'll create a bunch of test points based off image analysis. So I'll identify what is all the classes, and then that I'll create a accuracy assessment based off the classification of the tool, as well as that final population number. I'm going to compare that to the field-based reports that the United Nations publishes, which they claim is at a 95% confidence level. So if the tool's close to their estimates, I'll at least get a margin of error because they have high confidence in their numbers, and they report that information bi-weekly. So I plan on running a test kind of like before the growth of the camps began, to see if the population estimate for that test correlates to the population estimates from this field base, and then maybe pick a date a couple years later as the camp grew to see if my population estimate toolkit comes up with similar population estimates as the different reporting in the future. And then hopefully if it's within a certain level of error, and use that information to validate if the tool is successful or not in collecting the population estimates. And Ron asked for the conferences I'm considering. So I kind of just, I did try to search for like humanitarian and assistance and disaster response conferences out there, but I also looked just for general GIS conferences as well. Additionally, the All Partners Access Network is an international group that focuses on Hatter operations in the U.S. Indo-PACOM AOR, which I know one of the team leads that puts on that workshop here in Hawaii. So that's another venue that I would use to present at, because that would be my direct customer for this toolkit. So not only would I present there, but I would also provide this tool to all those different organizations that belong to that network to help them with future Hatter operations.
Okay, we need to move on. Thank you very much, Brandon. That was great.
Thank you. And thanks for everyone for the comments.
If you could stop sharing, that'd be good. Okay, Danielle, if you could load your presentation up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Alrighty.
Okay, whenever you're ready, go for it.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Danielle Barlow, and for my capstone, I'm looking at women's suffrage in Switzerland. Particularly, I'm focusing on how women's suffrage spread throughout the Swiss cantons, which is basically their equivalent of a state or a province, over the course of 3 decades. In order to understand women's suffrage at a national or a local level in the way that I'm going to be looking at it, it's important to understand the overarching trends of women's suffrage on a global scale. While in some countries female enfranchisement is still a struggle women are fighting in the present day, the climax of women's suffrage globally occurred mainly during the 20th century, with cultural changes and political circumstances revolutionizing a woman's previously designated place in society.
Hold on, Danielle. Your slides aren't changing at the same time as you're talking. Hold on.
Okay.
I don't know. What did you share?
Is it
Maybe
not?
try resharing your screen.
Okay, let me try again.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Thanks for telling me. Okay, let's try this again. Let me share. Let's try it this way. Okay.
Okay, that's better.
Do you see background women's suffrage?
Yep,
Okay.
perfect. Okay, continue.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so while each country has its own particular circumstances that led to the passing of women's suffrage, on a global scale, the date of women's suffrage tends to correlate to war and to the technological and social revolutions that typically follow these kinds of large-scale conflicts. A few examples of this phenomenon are the US and the UK, both of which declared women's suffrage soon after the end of World War I. France and Italy, as well as some surrounding countries, which notably passed women's suffrage soon after World War II. And many South American and African countries, which declared women's suffrage at the outset of their independence from European colonists. So for South America, these events occurred throughout the first half of the 20th century, and for Africa, they occurred mainly during the 60s and 70s. So in all these examples, you have a tipping point of women refusing to return to a previously inferior position. From World War I and World War II, women, for World War I and World War II, women stepped up into jobs and responsibilities in order to keep their countries running while the men were away at war. And then when the war was over, the women were loath to return to what was previously deemed their acceptable place after they had basically proven that they were equally capable to men. In the case of South America and Africa, the winning of independence meant the right to vote for previously oppressed minorities, and in many areas, new constitutions were thoughtful enough to not continue to oppress women the way that they had been oppressed by colonists. So considering this global trend and the cases of surrounding countries, it would be expected that Switzerland would follow the pattern of declaring women's suffrage after World War I or World War II. However, that's not what happened. It's a notoriously peaceful country, so Switzerland didn't participate in the First World War, and it only participated minorly in the Second. Therefore, its women weren't as impacted as women in the rest of Europe. And there wasn't that same call to action from women refusing to return quietly to their pre-war existence. So without these standard triggers of war and conflict that spurred Switzerland's European neighbors towards women's suffrage, what eventually led Switzerland down the path is a combination of its distinct history and culture. The first aspect to understand is that the founding of Switzerland. In 1848, the Swiss Federation was born into existence, making it the first European democracy to declare universal suffrage for all men. The democracy that they created was recognized around the world for its success, and the Swiss wore their superior democratic status as a badge of honor for years, never amending the constitution lest it disrupt the perfect balance they had seemingly struck at the creation of their new nation. That was until the European Convention on Human Rights in 1968, when the inherent flaws of the unamended and century-old, at this point, Constitution were made clear to the Swiss. Switzerland was not allowed to sign this accord because it was recognized that the country had several human rights violations, the most important of these being that it still did not allow women the right to vote. So the convention may have been a wake-up call for Switzerland, as it was still one of the very few countries in Europe denying women the right to vote at the time. However, their model democracy that had suited them for so many years also produced a unique challenge to women's suffrage. Unlike the surrounding countries that had passed women's suffrage through a vote of elected representatives or parliament, Switzerland had a semi-direct democracy, which required a national referendum in order to change anything in the constitution. What this would entail was a 2/3 majority of all voters in the country, as well as a 2/3 majority of all cantons in favor of this change. So it wouldn't be until 1971 that all the men in Switzerland managed to come together and vote 66% in favor of this change. Another factor that potentially impeded the speed of women's suffrage in comparison to nearby European countries is the manner in which Swiss women went about fighting for equality. So unlike the loud, insistent, and sometimes even violent women's suffrage protests that many of us are familiar with, coming from maybe the US or the UK, the approach of Swiss women was notably quieter, never violent, and for many years it was carried out almost entirely through academic articles and silent protests. Additionally, the messaging as to why women were fighting for suffrage was disjointed between various women's organizations, with some organizations still opposing women's suffrage as calling it unnecessary or frivolous as late as the 1950s. It wasn't until nearly 1960 that women's groups of varying points of views and religions banded together and unified under a singular message that they deserved the right to vote because it was a human right. While all these factors influence the path towards national women's suffrage, the pattern of female enfranchisement throughout the cantons is a less explained phenomenon. National women's suffrage was granted in 1971, but on a cantonal level, some women couldn't vote as late as 1990, creating this bizarre circumstance of some women being able to vote on national matters, but not on matters that impacted their immediate community. Additionally, this preliminary analysis of the progression of women's suffrage throughout the country, which you can see here on the left, shows a distinctly eastward moving trend, one that doesn't necessarily match the suffrage years of surrounding countries. So in the map on the right, you can see France in the west passed women's suffrage in 1944, while Germany in the east passed it in 1918. Conversely, the first cantons to pass women's suffrage in Switzerland were in the west in 1959, which border France, and the last were the Appenzell region, which is in the east, closer to Germany. So bearing these inconsistencies in mind, the aim of the study is to look at which elements may have influenced how suffrage spread throughout the cantons. These elements will include the population, average income, and dominant religion of the canton at the time of women's suffrage, as well as any geographic barriers such as large mountain ranges or swaths of water that may have impeded or directed the path of female enfranchisement. Using this data along with suffrage year for each canton, this study will determine if a correlation exists between suffrage years and the identified elements. So the data for this study has been entirely sourced from Swiss governmental sources, so either the Swiss Statistical Office or their open data site that they have. Imagery that's going to be used in the physical geography analysis is sourced from Landsat data, and any additional data such as female population numbers or dominant canton political party, which I'm currently looking into, will be sourced from governmental sources if at all, when at all possible. So the first element identified is average income. Literature on women's suffrage identifies income as a factor that both leads to and results from female enfranchisement, income levels that is. So taking into consideration the gap of pay between genders, as well as the fact that women of the mid 1900s received less opportunities for training in higher paying positions than men, an increase of women in the workforce would lower the median income for a canton. Therefore, more women living independently and working to support themselves, being a precursor to female enfranchisement in a canton, could be represented by a lower average income in that canton overall. Another element identified is religion, and it's particularly important in the passage of Swiss women's suffrage in the nation overall. So part of the root behind the differing messages between women's organizations identified as one of the impediments for national women's suffrage was religion. Secular, Protestant, and Catholic women's organizations differed vastly on their messages, their methods, and also their stances on women's suffrage for a long time, with Catholic groups being notorious holdouts in their support of women's suffrage. And it wasn't until 1957 that Catholic women's organizations finally joined with Protestant and secular organizations to unify behind a message and a stance. And with the first canton declaring suffrage in 1959, only 2 years later, it's possible that religion was as important to the individual cantons declaring suffrage as it was for the country as a whole. Lastly, in the particular case of Switzerland, geography needs to be taken into consideration, as the differences in terrain in Switzerland seem to reflect an earlier versus a later adopters of women's suffrage, as well as different cantonal cultural and linguistic histories. How isolated one canton is from its neighbors could be important in impacting not only how the population in that area grows, but also how the movement of ideas is undertaken between the cantons. To this end, a preliminary image extraction of 3 cantons was undertaken to better identify how this factor may correlate to differing women's suffrage dates. St. Gallen, which is the larger surrounding canton, passed women's suffrage in 1979, and the Appenzell region, which is that central area, declared suffrage in 1989 and 1990. So they were compared to reveal that development rates were drastically different between the two following the terrain of the country. So this supports the supposition that geography plays an important role in how the cantons developed over time. Looking at a similar canton-to-canton comparison of additional data between those of the most disparate women's suffrage dates reveals other potential correlation trends as well. So first, religion doesn't seem to necessarily always follow the Protestant pro and Catholic con trend that the history of Switzerland might suggest. Second, rather than low income indicating more independent women in the workforce, it's possible that this correlates more with more versus less populated areas. So a comparison of average income to female population, which is one of the data points that I'm currently working on acquiring, may reveal more on this account. So after all the analysis so far, it's expected that the progression of female enfranchisement throughout the country will most closely be correlated with geography and the population density of the cantons. The wild card element, so to say, in this analysis is the dominant religion of each canton. So, like I mentioned, literature would indicate that Protestant cantons would be more progressive, declaring women's suffrage earlier, while Catholic cantons were less accepting of the movement. However, as seen in the table in the previous slide, this correlation may not be as straightforward as expected and doesn't quite account for how religiously neutral cantons will fall into this correlation. Additional data, such as gender-specific population data and political party information, should be helpful in shedding some more light on the progression of cantonal women's suffrage as the study continues forward. So that concludes my research so far. Before taking any questions, I'd like to thank Dr. Blanford for her, her guidance during this process. And thank you all for your attention. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Okay, so do you have any access to educational level data? So I've been emailing back and forth with the Swiss Statistical Office because education was one of the factors that I was initially looking into, and they don't have it as far back as my analysis was planning to go. However, looking at the information that they did have, it wasn't necessarily separated by gender, and as well as it tended to reflect more of a canton's economic status as opposed to maybe it's like ideas of a female enfranchisement. Also in Switzerland, as of I think it was the late 1800s, education was mandatory for everyone, girls and boys, so it may not be, unless there's secondary education, it's not really reflective of, per se, the ideas of that canton. And then Ashley said, what methodology will you be using to correlate? So I haven't decided on what kind of correlation analysis I'm going to undertake yet. I'm still looking at the type and amount of data I decide to go with before really delving into how I want to go about which analysis type I want to go about doing. But if anyone has any suggestions of ones that I should look into, I'm all ears. I'm by no means an expert of everything, all the possibilities that are out there. So I'd love to see some suggestions and evaluations and whatnot. So Stephen says, what do you think were the predominant causes? What do you think were the predominant causes to change the policy? So on a cantonal level, I believe there's a large group of cantons that moved toward, that declared women's suffrage right around the time that the nation did. So there's, here, let me go back in the slides for a second. Here we go. So you can see the light green area all declared suffrage around the same time as a national level. So I'm less interested in those than I am in why there's a movement of those in the West being so much earlier than those in the East. And I'm not positive as to the correlation on that point, which is why I'm looking at a bunch of different data points to see what could possibly be the influencing factors. Was it something social? Was it just simply economic? Or was there something that the terrain, the movement of ideas through the country was just impeded in some way? still exploring possibilities.
Okay, it might look like that's all the questions. Thanks, Danielle. This is Beth. Justine had to leave for a little bit. She'll be back.
Yeah, all right. Thank you.
Yep, good job. So if you can go ahead and stop sharing, thank you. And Andrew, if you want to load up your slides.
How does that look?
That looks good.
Cool. Alrighty. Well, thank you. So my name is Andrew Riesenberger, and I'm doing and my subject is where to work, comparing quality of life across metropolitan areas based on locality pay differentials. So I'm going to run through my agenda. So just talk about like the background, how these federal locality pay areas come about, what the goals and my objectives of my project are, kind of what I got into through my literature review, how I'll be working with the data, and like how I'm going to be like approaching the topic that I'm tackling, the expected results, my timeline, and where I'm going to present. So the background of the federal locality pay and why I chose this. So the federal pay scale, if you're a federal employee, like they call it a general schedule employee, and it breaks down into a table of 15 grades, and there's 10 steps within each grade. I just started as a federal employee back in August. And every year for the first couple of years, you'll move up between steps, between grades, and then it takes a little bit longer to move up in between steps. But you can also move up from grade to grade after 1 year. And when you move up in between grades, it's going to be a lot more lucrative in terms of your compensation than it is to just wait for the years to go by and kind of stay in the same position. So obviously you're going to be taking on more responsibility because you're essentially getting a promotion, and you're probably going to be switching the job that you're doing when you move up between grades. You can't stick in the same thing and move up in grades, but you can move up in steps. But eventually that's going to get capped out, and you're not going to get paid as well as you would unless you take a job in the next higher grade. This is what the pay scale looks like. And obviously the differences in pay in between grades rather than steps within grade come at much higher increments, and these are just the base pay. What my project is going to get into is locality pay differentials. So depending on where you're located, you're going to receive a differential that's in addition to this base pay. So if you're, well, I'll get into that in a few steps, but depending on where you are, you're going to get a lot more than if you're just kind of in the middle of nowhere. So the way they set this federal locality pay is by basing it on federal and non-federal pay across the board, and they do salary surveys conducted by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And there's 52 different metropolitan pay areas. And then the 53rd is considered the rest of the US, which is basically any county that doesn't fall into one of these 52 designated locations. And it's constantly adjusted, and every year they kind of look into it to see, is the pay keeping up with what's fair and what the private sector is bearing. And they do try to just keep it competitive, because while there's lots of benefits for working for the federal government, they still want to offer competitive salaries, because you can tend to make more as a private sector employee rather than working for the feds. So this is the map from federalpay.org, and this kind of shows, it's like a heat map of where the highest locality pays are, and then basically that darker teal is going to be considered the rest of the US. So you can see over here that San Francisco, like the Bay Area, that's the highest locality pay area, where in addition to your base pay, you're going to be getting 40.37% more on top of that because this is considered like the most expensive area in the country to live. Followed closely behind that is LA, DC, New York. With these regions, you're going to be getting paid a lot more, well, I would say a higher percentage than you're going to be getting in the rest of US pay. But comes with that is a much higher cost of living, specifically. Well, that's also what I'm going to get into later, is just the value of what you're getting. Represented here, the darker teal is considered the rest of US, and you still do get a locality pay differential with that, but it's only 15.37%. So you're looking at 25% difference in terms of salary living in the Bay Area versus the rest of the US. But then comes with where you decide to work is how well you're going to be compensated for that. So the reason that I wanted to take this on is because I am a federal employee, and I've also been relatively transient in my job history over the last 6 years. And it's kind of a trend that's going to continue for me, because in order to continue making more money, which obviously is a motivation of mine, I want to end up where I'm the happiest, but it's also like, money matters, and you do kind of want to put yourself in a better economic situation. So a lot of times people are moving between grades, but if you're in the middle of nowhere, if you're in Kansas, it's a lot harder to find a federal position there than it is in DC. So if someone's ahead of you in your office or whatever, and there's not a position for you to move into, it's going to behoove you to move somewhere else where there's an opening, rather than wait for the person that's occupying a position in your workspace to retire or relocate themselves. And I'm also interested in like what causes people to move. Like, going into this, before I got into the literature review, I thought that economic reasons were going to be, by and large, the most important factor when people decided where they're going to move and why they're going to move. But even though that is a consideration, it's definitely not number one. So my goals and objectives are to obviously understand what factors are driving relocation. And I got a lot of that through the literature review, and I actually had a good time reading about this stuff because it opened my eyes and it kind of makes this project whole. So I want to develop an index that allows me to compare compensation with cost of living components in order to determine where federal pay is relatively strong and relatively weak. I'm going to be using data from a variety of sources to determine a method and how they can be combined in a manner that reflects a certain pay to a cost of living ratio. And I want to compare how this index relates to population change within federally designated areas and federally designated pay localities. So which areas are going to be growing the highest in this time span, and how are the areas that are experiencing high or low population change, how does that compare with what they're being offered in terms of compensation to work there? And excuse me, I realize I still have these comment bubbles on there, but I hope that's not too distracting. I also want to identify specific metropolitan localities that offer residents favorable combinations of these metrics. So where is the population occurring at the largest rate? And then where is it occurring at like much lower rates? And what are the differences in terms of characteristics in these localities? And then there's also like, so within localities, I also want to look at what are the specific, what's special about certain communities within larger localities. And that's something that after I've determined the general larger localities that people are moving to, I'm going to be looking at maybe like the highest, the specific region that experiences the highest population change and what specific communities are within that. And then also go out maybe like a different locality that has, lower population change much lower, and then the lowest, and then kind of compare the internal characteristics of these communities, and kind of determine what factors are or not driving people into these areas. So the literature review, getting into like macro migration motivations, basically like why people are kind of deciding to move from one pretty distinct area into another completely different region. And overall, it's like people, you vote with your feet, meaning that like you're going to move to the places that suit your preferences the best. If you're not happy in one specific region, you're probably going to seek out a location where the community better suits your all-around preferences, obviously. So there's two types of movement, temporary and permanent. Going to school is obviously going to be the most prevalent type of temporary movement. And then moving for good it's actually way less common than it is for temporary movement. Relocation tends to be a behavior exhibited more often by the affluents. Typically, if you're wealthier, that's going to give you the means to relocate, whether it's having the opportunity to go away and study, or just moving because you want a change of environment. And either way, it's kind of like self-fulfilling, because as you become more educated, education is tied with affluence, and it's going to have kind of a trickle-down effect with your family and those that come after you. The primary drivers of relocation from one region to another, job search is obviously going to be a huge one. Like I said, the opportunity to earn more money, but people also want to align themselves ideologically and politically with those that they share common interests with. So just you're going to have a Republican living in Vermont isn't going to be as well received as a Republican living in maybe Texas. So if that's something that's important to you, you're going to be a little bit more inclined to relocate. People also want to spend less and downsize. And meaning by that is like, you know, if you live in a very expensive area and you want to move somewhere else where the rent's cheaper or cost of living is a lot lower, that's going to be a significant driver as well. And generally, the main subset of society that is going to be the most mobile are going to be the millennials, the people in their 20s or 30s that have some or, you know, some sort of post-high school education. They don't own homes, or they're single or separated. Moving within communities. So like once, say you move to a specific region and you find you like it there, but eventually you can still move from one part of the city to the suburbs. And that's pretty much what the literature review revealed, is that the suburbs are going to be like the destination ultimately where people are going to want to end up, because there's a good balance between everything that you can kind of get in the city versus not being directly in the city. So you want to be close to things, you want to be hospital, shopping, everything like that. But you want to have a sense of community, but they find that having a sense of community is tied to having a sense of privacy, but also being able to talk to your neighbors. And that's kind of how like a lot of subdivisions for the last few decades have been developed, because they offer both sides of that. Also in the suburbs, you're going to have lower crime. People tend to find that the schools are better, and you still have that proximity to large cities. You're still, you know, the road networks still allow for accessibility close to airports. And it's just all around like a good mixture. So what my methodology, just get this out of the way. Thanks. I'm going to be using data from the Census Bureau, which the decennial census, and the American Community Survey, and data from MIT in order to capture cost of living metrics. And when I say this, I'm looking at average rent median home price, commute times, crime frequency, and income data. A lot of things people consider or take into consideration when they're looking at how good do I have it based on where I'm living. And then I want to take these factors and develop an index that kind of accounts for all of these and against how much you're being compensated for a specific area. And then once I have this ratio given with all these metrics, kind of compare the localities in terms of the ratio values on a national scale, and then how that stacks up with population change to these different regions. So, are people moving to San Francisco because you can get paid the most money there, even though the cost of living is through the roof? And then there's really everything in between that and the rest of the US designation, where maybe you're not going to be making as much, but you're going to be spending significantly less living in, say, Kansas City or Omaha, Nebraska, because there's just specifically the rental income and the rental costs are not nearly as high. After that, I want to examine a subset of selected localities that have different values and evaluate the community characteristics. So, what's different between a place that offers the best value versus like the lowest value based on the metrics, and what specifically within these communities, like how is it that much different? And I want to create a series of maps to help visualize these different factors and compare it with population change across the federally defined localities. Excuse me. Okay. So I would determine specific communities within the larger communities and determine specific communities within large localities and provide the residential excuse me. Sorry, I'm going to be using data from the ACS in order to, because it basically breaks down the data at a tract level, and you can, which is obviously going to be much smaller than at the county level. So with that, it basically will allow me to kind of compare data on a tract level at a much smaller scale than at the county level to determine specific trends in specific neighborhoods that offer better value than another community. In terms of challenging faced, I think the biggest thing that I'm going to have trouble with, and kind of like what I'm wrestling with now, is developing an index on how these different cost of living metrics can be weighted in relation to one another. So, if how much you're paying on rent or on your mortgage is the most important thing to you, but you don't really mind driving 3 hours each day to and from work, it's going to be a bit of a challenge to kind of find a compromise with the ratio that I developed that kind of accounts for these things. I considered creating multiple ratios, but I'm not quite sure how I'm going to handle this yet. And then once I'm kind of complete with my analysis, it's just like, okay, I've done this. I know which areas are going to give the best value based on these metrics, but then who do I share this with and how do I get it out there? Because it's, I think, information that's worth sharing. In terms of anticipated results, I believe that the localities that provide the most favorable value in terms of costs incurred and salary are not going to be the locations that offer the highest salary. Even though New York City and LA and San Fran offer the highest pay, I still don't think that they're going to have the highest value just because the cost of living is absurd. I think better value is going to be found in neighboring areas that have, Baltimore has the same locality pay that Washington, D.C. does, but rent and home prices are significantly lower here. But you may be dealing with different commute times, so there's different things to take into account. And I believe that some of the localities that boast the highest population increases will have some of the poorer ratio, because I think overall people are going to tend to disregard cost of living because there's a million different intrinsic motivations that are going to get people to move from place to place, but are they really making a logical choice or more of like an emotional choice? The timeline. So I'm pretty sure that the conference the conference I want to present at is going to be in late November. It's the week before Thanksgiving. So before that, obviously in the next coming months, synthesize all the spatial and tabular data that I'm going to get from the census, and kind of conduct my analysis to decide, where the value is and where the population changes, generate the index in order to account for the different quality of life metrics, and then create my maps and kind of be able to describe everything and see how things add up in terms of like what I think is going to happen. I think I'll be able to get everything done by August, but without that specifically broken out, that's kind of like my goal, is just to have it done before the end of summer. This is the conference. There's the Southeastern Division of the AAG, and it's at UNC Wilmington the days before Thanksgiving. And the contact from this particular conference told me that submittals are going to be due in early summer. So maybe in around about 2 months or so, they might be calling for submittals. I think with that, now I'm ready to field any questions. So Chad asks, will cost of living allowances be factored into my analysis? For federal employees, you don't really get a cost of living allowance. This is more like non-military. So I'm a federal employee now. Like I just get a set, my pay, that's my base pay plus my differential pay for my location, which is the DC Baltimore area. I think COLA doesn't really apply to federal employees, only military, I think. And this is really going to be only concerned with the US, so not overseas, that they tend to have different COLA allowances for employees, I believe.
Just to let you know, this is Brandon. In Hawaii, they actually do have COLA for federal employees, just to let you know.
Okay.
If you want to look into that. Because we actually, I think we're 17% locality, which is, as your map that was showing the different localities, is one of the lowest you can have in the world, despite, or in the country, despite the fact that Hawaii has the highest cost of living. Like the average 2-bedroom house is going to cost about $900,000 on the island if you're on Oahu. So at the lowest pay and the highest cost of living, they give us a little bit of a COLA to try to offset that, but we're still under DC. Additionally, I had one more comment, especially for the areas that are like the Washington DC area. Some of the factors that I know when I used to live in that area was actually income tax. Some people chose Virginia over Maryland because of the difference between the income tax. I'm not sure if you were planning on factoring that in. And then there's always, like you said, there's a lot of like the locations of where the jobs are kind of political based, where like, especially as a lot of federal organizations are moving out of the DC into the surrounding suburbs, there's a lot of political like dealings for certain states and areas to kind of get those headquarter locations, like the FBI headquarters, move, which some people, like, they might be more in love with their job versus what makes sense financially. But other than that, look forward to seeing what your results are as a federal employee to see why I'm stupid and live in Hawaii and get paid less.
That is something I considered, and specifically property tax in terms of like home ownership was something that I'm really considering as well, because you kind of take into account what matters to you, and in Baltimore it's rather high. So I did think about adding that in, and I'm still like kind of swirling around the whole ideas about how this matrix is going to be created and everything that's going to go into it. But I definitely appreciate your input. So Brittany is asking if I considered making a dynamic geoprocessing tool that allows people to rank what's important. I did think about that too, and not specifically a tool, but how, is there like something that allows me or allows anybody to really punch in to what they rank as the most important factor for them. So it's an option that I've considered, and it's certainly on the table. And I think between now and the time that I'm actually going to do my presentation, that I have a lot of leeway to kick around what's going to work and what I can make work. So yeah, I definitely appreciate you bringing that up. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no other questions, Andrew, you can go ahead and stop sharing, and Chad can start sharing. Nice job, Andrew.
Thank you, ma'am.
Can everyone hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay, so let me get this here. And can we see that?
Yeah, so you'll probably just want to start your slideshow.
Here we go. There we go.
Great.
Well, hello everyone, my name is Chad Cochran. Thank you for joining me with my peer review of my capstone project, communication between UAVs and ground control stations using ESRI visibility analysis tool. So to start out, we have to answer a key question about communication between the UAVs. So what is the area within which a UAV can maintain communication with ground control beacons without disruption in high relief areas? So as we move along, my project objectives will be to define an inverse azimuthal viewshed, also known as a visibility corridor, the creation of methodology for the inverse azimuthal viewshed, and to demonstrate the utility of the viewshed itself. Oops, I'm sorry. I need to go back one slide, so excuse me. So this presentation seeks to prove the utility of an inverse azimuthal tool, also known as a visibility corridor. This tool will provide data that enhances an already available ArcGIS tool for visualizing line of sight from a point to an area to relay a visibility factor. Within this scope, the inverse azimuthal tool will derive elevation obstructions for a commercially available or off-the-shelf UAV. These proofs and pertinent data will be determined by using the methodology below on a desert terrain with high elevation relief within the United States. So my project parameters. A total of 5 parameters were used in this project. So they were a maximum of 400 feet for the UAV, and that is an FAA mandate, and that is section 107 if you're interested. The elevation data over the United States, high desert, or the basin and range region. So the minimum elevation for the tile that I used was 1,115 meters, and the maximum elevation was 2,634 meters. The range of the UAV is 27 kilometers. Now, this is not the maximum extent of the range for the UAV. This is what actually fit into the digital elevation model tile. So we also have to have a static ground control communication point, and that will also be referred to as an origin point. And we had a fixed wing UAV, not a 4-rotor, 6-rotor, or 8-rotor helo type. So what is an inverse azimuthal line of sight? Well, it's a polygon derived from the spatial analyst visibility analysis tool that incorporates Pythagoras' theorem and manual drawing techniques to capture the area of visibility between aerial vehicles and communication points or origin points within an area of interest based upon an X, Y, and Z data. So this is just this graphic here is a rudimentary representation of the connectivity between a control tower on the bottom right and the derivate to a UAV upper right, and the derivation of obstructions from a visibility corridor analysis that allows a UAV to avoid obstructions such as mountains on the left within its range. So what does an inverse azimuthal line of sight accomplish? So to avoid catastrophic events impacting current operational UAV systems, a means to avoid obstructions between ground control beacons and UAV platforms must be addressed to ensure constant line of sight for communication and control. A constant line of sight between a beacon and a UAV may be interrupted, but is needed to avoid a catastrophic failure event. So what is a catastrophic failure event? Well, those encompass interruptions of electronic communications due to physiographic features, such as mountains, elimination of UAVs through crashes, and human error by flying beyond communication thresholds or ranges. So in order to mitigate the mission disruption, one must eliminate likelihoods of this by using software for deriving vertical obstructions in mountainous topography, and the use of open source mathematical tools and ESRI software provides a path to facilitate such functions. The inverse azimuthal line of sight will be referred to a visibility corridor from this point on. So the visibility corridor creation steps. So to create a visibility corridor, 5 steps are needed, and they are to create the point profile, use a right angle calculator or Pythagorean theorem, control the visibility analysis tool, use the visibility analysis tool with its appropriate variables, and manually drawing lines, points, and polygons to derive it. So the elevation data that I used in this project. This elevation data was commercially available and is sufficient for the needs of this project. So the pre-production estimated accuracies for this global product were 20 meters at 95% confidence for vertical data and 30 meters at 95% confidence for horizontal data. Initial studies to validate and characterize the Aster GDIM confirm that pre-production accuracy estimates are generally achieved for most of the global land surface, although results vary. And true accuracies do not meet pre-production estimates for some areas. In addition, version 1 of the Aster GDIM does contain certain residual anomalies and artifacts that affect the accuracy of the product and may be impediments to effective utilization for certain applications. Consequently, METI, the Japanese Space Agency, and NASA, the American Space Agency, acknowledge that version 1 of the Aster GDIM should be viewed as experimental or research grade. That is why in this project I used the Aster GDIM 2. So what that means is it has void fill and it is cut down into 1 degree by 1 degree tiles and is not considered research or experimental. So moving on, creating the point profile graph. So to determine the elevation of the origin point, a point elevation profile was created. by creating additional points in the attribute table and placing them as a layer over the elevation data, then utilizing the interpolate line function in the 3D Analyst tool set, an elevation profile or point profile graph was derived in meters for the offset A or point of origin. They can be derived, the profile graph tools on the 3D Analyst interactive toolbar are used to derive a graphic representation of one or many profiles. Profiles can be generated from any 3D line feature drawn over a surface. So you can create profiles on either a raster, a triangulated irregular network, or TIN, or a terrain dataset surface. Profile graphs can also be derived by drawing a 3D line over a set of points or multi-points. So profiles also show the change in elevation of a surface along a line. Profiles help assess the changes in elevation or evaluate the feasibility of placing an origin point in a given area. So for this project, the origin point elevation was 1,439 meters, which is basically a median for the two ranges of the elevation in the tile itself. So controlling the Spatial Analyst Visibility Analysis tool. The next slides will describe how to control the Spatial Analyst Visibility Analysis tool provided by ESRI. So this image graphically depicts how visibility analysis is controlled. The observation point is on the mountaintop to the left, or the OF1 in the image. The direction of the view shed is within the cone looking to the right, and you can control how much to offset the observation point. For example, the height of a tower, the direction to look, and how high and low to look from the horizon. It also depicts the functions and attribution features to create an understanding of the tool capacity and functionality. So what does it do? The visibility tool in the ESRI ArcMap toolbox determines the raster surface locations visible to a set of observer features and identifies which observer feature points are visible from each raster surface location. So using the tool function allows the user to plot a point using an XY coordinate. Once this is established, the attribute table will be available for viewing in a few slides. Within the attribute table, 8 items in total will be enabled. If the attribute table is incomplete, a manual addition of the field that is omitted will be necessary. We'll look at the attribute table later in the presentation. So moving to offset A. The offset A item indicates a vertical distance in surface units, or meters in this case, to be added to the Z value of the observation point, OF1. If offset A exists in the feature attribute table, its value is added to the spot elevation when present, or the origin point elevation. Otherwise, it is added to the interpolated surface Z value. The offset A value must be positive. If the offset A item does not exist, default is 1. And this must match the elevation of the origin point. So for this project, it was 1,439 meters. Offset B. The offset B item indicates a vertical distance in surface units to be added to the Z value of each cell as it is considered, for visibility. If offset B exists in the feature attribute table, its value is added to the surface Z value of each cell location when it is being analyzed for visibility. The value must be positive, and if no offset B item is found in the feature attribute table, it defaults to 0. So in this case, it was 400 feet above the origin point of 1,439 meters. So the offset is the vertical distance in meters to be added to the Z value of a location on the surface, or 133 meters. There are 2 offset items, one defining the elevation to be added to the observer location, or offset A, and the other defining what will be added to each cell to be considered for visibility. The derivative factors from the open source right angle calculator will be included in this portion for offset B. And this project, once again, used 133 meters or 400 feet. Azimuth 1. The azimuth 1 item defines the start angle of the scan range. If this item does not exist in the feature attribute table, it defaults to a value of 0, and the default was used. Azimuth 2. The azimuth 2 item defines the end angle of the scan range. The value for the azimuth 2 must be greater than that of azimuth 1. If this item does not exist in the feature attribute table, it defaults to a value of 360, creating a full circle. If both azimuth 1 and azimuth 2 are not defined, the defaults will give a full 360-degree sweep. The azimuth items define the horizontal angle limits to the scan. The sweep proceeds in a clockwise direction from the first azimuth to the second, and the values for the angle are given in degrees from 0 to 360, with 0 oriented to north, and in this section, the default was used for the 360-degree sweep. Vert 1. The Vert 1 item defines the upper horizontal angle limit of the scan. If this item does not exist in the feature attribute table, it defaults to a value of 90, and the default was used. Vert 2. The Vert 2 item defines the lower horizontal angle limit of the scan. The value for Vert 2 must be less than that of Vert 1. If this item does not exist in the feature attribute table, it defaults to a value of -90. The vertical angle defines the vertical angle limits to the scan. The angles are expressed in degrees between 90 and -90, with positive values representing angles above the horizontal plane or the horizon, and negatives below it, as you can see in B2, the bottom right-hand side. The horizontal plane, or 0 degrees, is defined by the Z value of the observation point plus the value of offset A. Both vertical angles can be negative, but for this project, Vert 2 was 0.5, and this will be addressed later in the presentation through the Pythagorean theorem or the right angle calculator. Radius 1. The radius 1 item defines the start distance from which visibility is determined. Note that cells closer than the radius 1 search distance are not visible in the output raster, but they can still block the visibility of cells between radius 1 and radius 2. So for this project, the default radius 1 distance is 0. Radius 2. So cells beyond the radius 2 search distance are excluded from the analysis. This value for radius 2 should be greater than radius 1, and the default radius 2 distance is infinity, but for this project is 27 kilometers, or the range of the UAV in the tile. The radius items limit the search distance when identifying areas visible from each observation point. Cells that are beyond a certain distance can be excluded from the analysis. And as I stated, for this project, the radius was 27 kilometers. So moving on, this is an example of the parameters for the dialog box when using the visibility analysis tool. So as you can see, there are nine observer parameters. And this defines the use of fields in the attribute table and establishes the parameters of observer functionality. The attribute table. So 8 fields are identical to the observer parameters. The attribute table of the point feature was edited to include an additional 8 fields. So they're identical to the observer parameters of the Spatial Analyst Visibility Analysis Tool dialog box in the previous slide. This allows for ease of use when dealing with multiple elevation parameters or multiple elevation data sets, and is the most easily edited. So for my project, I actually did 4 types of visibility analysis over different terrain, and I'm using the desert terrain as my example due to its robust results. So using the right angle calculator to derive a Vert 2. As we discussed earlier in the Vert 2, it is the angle from the offset A to the offset B, derived through the Pythagorean theory. So as you can see in the lowercase a on the left-hand side, it is 400, and that is feet. And so when you put that in there with your lowercase side b or your range, for this example, it was 43,000 meters, you come up with a 0.5. So this correlates as the dashed line in the upper right-hand graphic. So you can see the difference between the offset A to the offset B, or the height of the UAV from the ground control station. And the vert2 is the dashed line, and that is the 360-degree sweep at that altitude that the visibility analysis tool will be doing. So in this slide, the right angle calculator was used to derive the vert2 using the known parameter of 400 feet and the range of the UAV, the uppercase A right underneath the vert2 was used from offset A to offset B as the scan elevation. So now we'll move along and see some analysis. So false visibility. So if you look at this slide, the pink area nearest the origin point till the visible obstruction will be visible to the UAV. So the origin point is the communication tower, and the visible obstruction is actually mountains or elevation that is higher than the fly altitude of the UAV. So the visibility analysis tool is deriving the obstruction for the visible area. So the visible area is actually a no-fly area for the UAV, and the construction of the visibility corridor will highlight this. So when deriving this, pink is no visibility, which means there are no obstructions, and green is visible obstructions that were found through the analysis. So caution must be used at this point in the analysis because of the completed visibility field that the visibility tool's results have concluded. The visibility tool analysis will not predict a straight line view regarding the obstructions. So if you can see from the origin point, there is no visibility or no obstructions to the visible obstructions to a no obstruction. So the UAV cannot cross that corridor, otherwise there is a disruption in the communication. So the obstructions realistically will block communications to the control point or the origin point, but will be unobstructed according to the visibility analysis tool. So creating the visibility corridor steps. In order to create the visibility corridor, 3 steps must be completed. The first step is to draw lines from the origin point in red in a 360-degree radius to the right angles of the obstruction face in white. The lines must be limited to the point where the lines either 1, intersect another obstruction closest to the origin point, or 2, are drawn to the extent of the range of the UAV using the Create Feature tool. The amount and extent of the lines being created is directly related to the precision and accuracy of the elevation data being processed. The higher the precision and accuracy of the elevation data, the more lines that will need to be drawn, and vice versa. So in this slide, it is possible to see the drawn lines in purple at the right angles of the obstruction face, the intersection of the lines on the obstruction face, and the termination of the line at the extent of the range of the UAV, all annotated by a red circle and type. Points in blue were added to reflect the second step in the process of creating the visibility corridor in the next slide. So points are added to the line endpoints. So after they've been drawn, points must be drawn at the endpoints of each line. This is completed by also using the Create Feature tool in ArcGIS, which is manually intensive. This process will also provide a quality control. Quality control comes in the form of deriving a more accurate right angle line plot and or intersection of the lines to the obstruction face. Any deviance or miscalculated line can be corrected by placing a more accurate point at the XY coordinate of the line endpoint at a closer scale. So the third step in creating. One moment here. Okay. Creating the visibility corridor, step 3. A manual create feature drawing function is also used to derive a single polygon by connecting the points that were drawn at the intersection of the polylines and continued onto the face of the obstruction profile in a 360-degree radius. The final shapefile or polygon is the visibility corridor, in which the UAV will have direct communication with the command and control site beacon based on a static line of origin, elevation data, static altitude, and radius, and the line of sight tool analysis in ArcGIS. Secondly, the points must be connected to create a visibility corridor. So my results. The desert scenario for the creation of the visibility corridor was the most robust in results of 4. The desert terrain elevation resembles a more mountainous terrain and has a high terrain relief elevation from 1,115 meters to 2,634 meters. The visibility analysis tool for this scenario demonstrated the utility in creating the visibility corridor to maintain communication capabilities. Multiple areas of relief were noted in this scenario, and the deriving of a visibility corridor for a UAV was manually intensive. Visibility corridor for this project polygon was created by plotting 1,515 points. After the creation of the polygon, the visibility percentage was created by dividing the area of the visibility corridor, 737.06 square kilometers, by the area of the range, 2,434.8 square kilometers, for a percentage of 30. In terms of the results for creating a visibility corridor for this desert scenario, the use of the ESRI visibility analysis tool is a practical foundational tool. The use of the tool in areas of high relief is notably effective based on the capacity to control the angles of visibility analysis, the range of the visibility, and the location of the origin points. So in conclusion and my summary, this project has defined what the inverse azimuthal visibility is, what it is used for, the manual steps and methodology involved to create a visibility corridor, and provided results and visual representation of the utility of the processes involved to maintain communications between UAVs and ground control stations. The creation of the inverse azimuthal viewshed is effective in mitigation of catastrophic failures for UAVs. So my future considerations. So the next steps forward in the development of the visibility corridor application using the visibility analysis tool is to eliminate the inefficient drawing time of intersecting lines to the elevation face, manual placement of points at the endpoints of each line, and the drawing of the polygon itself through a model or a Python script. Additionally, the use of a grid or a gradical could be useful in the creation of flight plans within the corridor, utilizing X, Y, and Z coordinates to avoid communication disruptions. Also, the level of accuracy and precision of elevation data will create more accurate results. Commercially available LiDAR will increase the accuracy and precision of the visibility corridor within the parameters mentioned in this project. With more processing power and storage capacity, piles of LiDAR elevation data could be ingested for a more precise final project. Here are my references, and at this point, I'd like to open it up for any questions. Let's see here. Okay, let's see here.
Does anybody have any questions? There might be some people typing, so we'll give it another
Okay,
Nice job.
thank you. So here is a question from my advisor. Assuming scripting, et cetera, how much user expertise would another user need to use this tool? First, you would absolutely need some background in visibility analysis or line of sight viewshed creation. But in terms of that, the tool that you use actually does the scan from the control beacon or the origin point. And what that allows it to do is you'll have to use it in a different capacity. So when you're creating the visibility corridor, whenever you come up to elevation data that has been classified as visible from the analysis, that is an exclusionary zone. So when you start doing your manual creation by drawing the lines to the right angles or to the extent of the range, what you'll find out is you'll be coming up against that elevation or that face, the obstruction face, and you'll find that once you create this visibility corridor, it's going to basically be the profile of an obstruction face, and that will give you your parameters. So you need to view this as the opposite of what the visibility analysis tool is actually providing you, or the inverse of it. Does that answer your question, Professor Miller?
Okay, well, it looks like there aren't any other questions, so.
I have one more, ma'am.
Oh, there you go. Sorry. Thanks, Ashley.
So from Ashley, if you were able to automate this whole thing, would you consider putting it into a web map or some kind so other UAV users could use it by adding their origin point? Actually, I have presented already at the ESRI Midwest Conference, and ESRI wanted the, I waived my copyright, and they are going to be looking at the analytics. And in terms of scripting, the University of Missouri professor there, I am in contact with her. She is looking at writing the scripts and providing it to an open source web. So not quite a web map, but we're looking to put it just straight open source for anyone to get. Thank you.
Okay, now I think questions are done.
Okay.
Again, nice job, Chad. If you want to stop sharing, and Ed can load his slides.
Can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. So hello everyone. My name is Ed Santos, actually Edgar Rey Santos. So first I would like to express my gratitude to Professor James O'Brien for his insightful guidance on this project. And as you see, my proposal is entitled Considerations on Using Serverless Functions for Geoprocessing Tasks. So next, a quick overview of what I have here to present today. The context of this research, goal, potential cloud advantages, cloud service models, serverless, justification and research approach, my timeline, and the cited work. The context of how this project idea started has to do with, number one, my current work as system administrator, where I have to understand application needs and computer resources. Second, some experience I have running time-consuming geoprocessing tasks. And third, my imaginings of possibilities when I took the 865 class entitled Cloud and Server GIS. The baseline is that cloud technology offers an impressive amount of computer resources. That got me thinking and asked the question, can GIS professionals use cloud technology to improve their work? So after working on this proposal, I was able to define a more specific goal compared to that general question. And the goal is, the project seeks to understand the viability and the possible benefits of employing serverless platform to run geoprocessing intensive tasks. So I'd like to point out potential cloud advantages. They are relevant to my project and can be seen as advantages in comparison to traditional on-premise computer infrastructure. One, reduce time in purchasing and provisioning computer resources. In traditional setting, the purchasing and configuration would take months, and by using cloud, you can have a server in a matter of minutes. This potentially especially beneficial for startups that can have servers right away and dispose them if they are no longer necessary. Number two, optimal use of resources. Easy to scale using less or more computing power. This guarantees the resources are available if there is high demand, or it can scale down to reduce costs if demand is low. Oops, did I skip something? Sorry. Number three, benefit from highly qualified professionals in each area of computer infrastructure. The backup professionals working on AWS, for example, by inheritance, the ones working for you, they are the ones doing your server backup if you're using AWS as an example. Next slide. There are many levels of server and application configurability that are offered. Some of those common ones I'm presented here. And to clarify what they are, I'm giving examples that are common to us here. So first, infrastructure as a service is when you manage your server on the cloud. We install and configure your application. One example is RGS server. So in the infrastructure as a service, you are given the Windows server, and then you manage yourself the installation and configuration of ArcGIS. Next, platform as a service. You are given an application that you can add code and customize it according to our requirements. Also, I give an example, ServiceNow used by Penn State University. So this application is, you can put code there to customize it. Next is software as a service. You have access to configure aspects of the system, but not customize it programmatically. Zoom, that we are using now is an example of software as a service. And next, function as a service, also called serverless. There's some discussion if they're the same or not, but in the context of my research, I will refer them as being the same. So serverless is a platform to deploy code where you don't need to worry about configuring services such as network and scalability. The serverless framework takes care of those aspects automatically. How serverless works. So to clarify, a cloud function that follows some input-output patterns to meet the serverless framework provider requirements. So number one, how serverless works. So the developer uploads the function code to the cloud provider framework. AWS Lambda is one example of serverless. Number two, the function is in its elementary state is inactive and take no memory or processor resources. Number three, events will trigger the function execution and the function becomes active. Four, the framework allocates the resources for the function execution. When the execution ends, the resources are deallocated and the function is back to its non-active mode. Accordingly, some of the function as a service characteristics are, number one, users are developers. Two, there is no server to configure. Three, costs are based on resources allocated to run a function. While the function is inactive, there is no cost. Four, functions have a limited lifetime on AWS's 15 minutes. There are several events that can trigger functions. They are defined by each cloud provider. Example of events are file storage, a new file, for example, scheduled tasks once every hour, for example, and HTTPS requests. Well, one example is user clicks on a button in a web page. Number six, in a traditional setting, it takes a team and days to set up a server once the code is ready. By using serverless, the developer just uploads the code and the service is deployed. Not surprisingly, serverless is not recommended for all types of software solutions. Some of the issues to consider are code cannot access low-level hardware resources. So if iTunes optimization is desired, there's a limitation there. Function lifetime is limited. Potential bottlenecks if there is intense input-output. And portability of code between cloud providers is not straightforward. For example, moving from AWS to Azure will require some recoding. From my literature review, I identify my premise or justification. Number one, serverless is popular for the Internet of Things, lightweight web pages, and coupling mechanism between cloud providers. Number two, not much work has been done on scientific computer using serverless. Number three, the understanding of geoprocessing using serverless is a welcome addition to research and can be used as a reference for JS professionals. I divided the research approach in three items. Number one, the method is exploratory research. This means that the results of exploratory research are not usually useful for decision making by themselves, but they can provide significant insight into a given situation. And I can use the word proposed in a few places. Number two, research questions. A, are serverless platforms like AWS Lambda a recommended service resource to run remote sensing image analysis? And B, can remote sensing emergency response workflows benefit from using serverless? Important to notice, item number one means that I can have additional questions and answers later on in the project. Number three, resources I'm gonna use Python, since it is a common language in geoprocessing and serverless platforms. AWS Lambda as my platform, and to help me understand and choose a proper analysis, I'll take the class 883, that is remote sensing image analysis and applications. My proposed deliverables, number one, a document describing the research elements such as goal, methods, results, and the conclusion. Number two, technical document describing the deployment of the function on AWS Lambda. Number three, code used on the research work. Number four, presentation of the research at the SRC 2020. So here's my timeline. I think the key here to mention for me is to take the 883 class, because that's where I'm gonna define the geoprocessing method that I'm gonna use. So that's the more focused GIS problem, and also the area of study. And before that time, I will start setting up my AWS account and do some tests. After the class, I will use the geoprocessing workflow, transform into a Lambda format and deploy the function. And then by the spring of 2020, when I gonna do the 596B class, is when I'm gonna do the write-up. And then in July 2020 is the presentation of the research. And that's it for my slides. I guess I'm ready for the questions. I see I have a question here ready. If you're able to automate.
Ed, that was from the previous.
Oh, okay. All right.
Wait to see if anybody types any questions for you.
All right.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Good job. You have
Thank you.
a nice relaxed pace. You have whole year to go, so it's kind of nice to have a lot of time to work on that.
That's true.
And like you said, take 883.
Yes.
Okay, so again, good job. I guess if we don't have any questions, we can move on to Ashley's. Ed, if you can stop sharing yours.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Yep, thank you. And Ashley, go ahead and share your screen when you're ready.
I was muted. Sorry. I could not figure out why you guys couldn't hear me. We're here. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Technology is hard. Can you see my screens?
Yep, looks good.
I even practiced this and I already screwed it up. It's fine.
It's all good.
Okay, first I wanted to thank Adrian Goldsberry and Dr. Kessler for putting up with my shenanigans on a constant basis. They are fantastic. So, okay, so my capstone, my name is Ashley Lanier, and my capstone will be on marijuana dispensaries and crime in Denver. Specifically, I want to study the effects of dispensary locations on the spatial autocorrelation of crime rates in Denver, Colorado. So here's an overview of what I'll be discussing today, including background and history, research questions, previous research, crime theories, methodology, challenges, expected results, and my timeline going forward. So the marijuana legalization debate has been a focus point of discussion for many years in our country. One popular argument against legalizing marijuana is that it will increase crime in the vicinity of the dispensary the same way a bar or liquor store does. And others believe it may actually reduce crime due to police being able to focus on enforcing more major crimes and the additional security dispensary locations have to put into place, either forced legally or on their own due to having to be cash-only businesses. This includes things like security cameras inside and out, as well as security guards. Although medical marijuana has been legalized in the state since 1979, there was no actual legal regulatory system in place until the year 2000 when Amendment 20 was passed. This limited caregivers to up to 5 patients. The year 2000 is the beginning of the first of 3 key modern eras for marijuana legalization in Colorado. The first is the early medical marijuana era, which spans from the year 2000 to 2008. Due to Amendment 20 limiting patients per caregiver, there was no need for a dispensary, and in fact, there were no known dispensaries in Colorado during this time. It was not until the medical marijuana commercialization and expansion era, which spans from 2009 to the present day, that a judge overturned the limitation of patients, causing an explosion in the medical marijuana market. Finally, in 2010, Colorado legislature passed a bill legalizing medical marijuana dispensaries, or MMDs. And by the end of 2012, there were over 532 licensed MMDs in Colorado. Then in 2012, voters approved Amendment 64, which made Colorado the first state in the US to legalize recreational use of marijuana and began the recreational marijuana era. Starting in January 2014, the first retail marijuana businesses in Colorado were licensed. It is important to note that due to fees and taxes associated with recreational-only dispensaries, 90% of dispensaries in Denver are both medical and recreational dispensaries, and is why I will not be differentiating between them in my research, and I will discuss that a little bit further later. So my research questions. I'll be exploring the spatial analysis between crime trends in Denver, Colorado, and aggregated marijuana dispensary locations at the census tract level where recreational and medical marijuana dispensaries have opened. The question I will be answering with my analysis include: do dispensary locations affect spatial autocorrelation of crime types? What types of crime are showing statistically significant effects? And is there a statistically significant difference in crime rates over time? I will be analyzing data from 2013, 2014, and 2018. This time range encompasses the year before recreational legalization, the year after, and the current year to investigate if there is statistically significant change over time. I want to understand if crime rates are trending to show increased crime where dispensaries are located, or has crime actually gone down? And is there statistical proof that these two data sets have a relationship with one another, a spatial relationship? So why Denver, Colorado? Well, in 2012, Colorado was the first state to legalize recreational use of marijuana, and in 2013 allowed for recreational dispensaries to sell it, as I previously discussed. This results in over 5 years of data for research purposes. Denver is one of the municipalities within Colorado that continues to legalize recreational use of marijuana, and is one of the largest municipalities that has for population and for their dispensaries. As of April 3rd, 2019, so just a few weeks ago, in Denver alone, there were 346 total recreational medical marijuana dispensaries. Additionally, the city has an open data catalog with all of the data I need for this type of research, and they update it very frequently. So they're pretty awesome about their data. So it wasn't difficult for me to get it. Ample research has been conducted on the correlation of crime rates in dispensary locations. Less research, however, has been conducted on spatial autocorrelation. I chose to study Denver because of the amount of data available and ease of access to it, as well as the research gap for the spatial relationship between the two data sets. The main studies I looked into for this project span across Denver, California, and the Washington-Oregon border. None of these studies, however, used more than 3 years of data. And for studies conducted in Denver, data ends at 2015, when the market for recreational dispensaries was still very new. This project will explore data across a longer time period than previous studies on this topic, spanning from 2013 to 2018. I believe this will give a better sense of trends in crime after the hype of the new market calms down. Several commonalities and differences were observed in previous studies. For example, all of the studies that were conducted at the census block level or at a finer scale agreed that dispensaries and crime are positively correlated, but only in adjacent study areas and not directly within the dispensary's block or grid cell. Each of these studies determined that it is due to the security measures implemented at dispensary units, such as video cameras and security guards. On the other hand, when studies are conducted at the census tract level or a broader scale, they show opposite results and determine that crime is not correlated to dispensary locations, and they did not observe correlations in adjacent census tracts. These varying results are likely due to modifiable aerial unit problem, or MOP. MOP is a known issue in spatial statistics and is the problem when too large or too small of a scale or aggregation scheme lead to a variation of results from statistical analysis. I did not see MOP addressed at all in any of the previous studies, but I personally will be taking this into account for my project. I haven't concluded how exactly I will do this, if I will just speak to it, or if there's some kind of test or different scale that I can run this analysis on, but it is something that I will be considering. So some of the similarities I found in previous research includes methodologies and the variables used to weight their data. Every one of the studies I read incorporated the same 2 crime theories to define their weighted variables. In order to properly analyze and map crime, it's essential to understand crime theories that will impact the analysis. Analyzing and mapping crime is more complex than just did the event happen or not, especially when we are dealing with the spatial aspect and trying to understand why crimes happen where they do. There's different variables that need to be taken into account because they have been proven to predict where crime may take place. If these are not considered, the results for the new variable being measured could be skewed or incorrectly interpreted. So what are these crime theories? The first of the 2 commonly used theories for crime mapping is social disorganization theory. This was first introduced in 1942 when Shaw and Mackey found crime was not evenly dispersed across time and space, And in their work, they found that social deficiency and poverty were positive correlates with crime patterns. Essentially, this theory explains that there are socioeconomical variables such as demographic, economic, social, family disruption, and urbanization that cause social deficiency and therefore can be used to predict crime spatially and temporally. Multiple studies have tested different variables and concluded that the following are positive correlates of crime rates: high poverty, low education, high housing age, racial heterogeneity, residential stability, residential mobility, and population. So the second of the two theories is routine activity theory. And this was introduced in 1979 post-World War II, where it was concluded that social disorganization theories proposed likely causes for rising crime were less relevant after the war. Socioeconomic variables were improving, yet crime was still rising. So what was proposed in routine activity theory is that three conditions must exist and converge in time and space in order for most crime to occur: a likely offender, a suitable target, and the absence of a capable guardian. They assessed that the other socioeconomic factors discussed in social disorganization theory did not themselves have a huge impact on crime rates. Rather, they contributed to the supply of opportunities and consequently crime would occur. The key idea is that people act in response to situations. Therefore, the kinds of situations they encounter in their daily lives influences their crime involvement. This is applied over space and time, essentially saying that different places at the same time will have different types of activities. Therefore, crime is not random or uniform across space. So how does routine activities theory apply to the analysis of crime rates in dispensary locations? Dispensaries usually operate with large amounts of cash, as we talked about earlier, due to federal laws making it difficult or impossible to bank. According to routine activities theory, operating with large amounts of cash makes a dispensary or those working there a suitable target and therefore more vulnerable to crime. On the other hand, with specific laws in place requiring security guards and security cameras or specific hours of operation, applying routine activity theory would actually suggest this should curb that vulnerability, and so therefore there should be less crime. So it's important to understand both theories and use both to fully understand the patterns observed in this research project. Accounting for these theories will help to determine if the crime rate patterns I am analyzing are impacted by the dispensaries, or if it's more likely due to the socioeconomic, sociodemographic, and routine activity conditions that make a dispensary location more vulnerable to crime. So I will be investigating the spatial relationship of crime rates in marijuana dispensaries in Denver using spatial autocorrelation and taking into account MOP if possible. I will investigate the statistical significance of change over time using analysis of variance or ANOVA. And I will utilize two frequently used crime theories to inform my research. That's the social disorganization theory and routine activity theory. So my methodology, I was able, well, for the data first, I was able to get my data from three main sources: the City of Denver Open Data Catalog, the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Program, and American Communities 5-year survey from the Census Bureau. For my boundary and crime theory variable data, I acquired statistical neighborhood boundaries from the City of Denver, as well as census tract boundaries. I chose tract data because it's easier to aggregate the variables I'll be quantifying, and it matches the statistical neighborhood boundaries. For population data, I use the ACS, or American Community Survey, 5-year tract data for the 3 years that I'll be studying, 2013, 14, and 18. So all this came as a table and then was joined to the tract data. As I mentioned before, there are variables that need to be taken into account when mapping crime because they have been proven to predict where crime may take place. So although I've not done this yet, I'm going to use the same census data for my weighted variables based on crime theory. The way I will weight my data to account for this will be to quantify the following variables for each location. It'll be population between ages 15 to 19, unemployment, household income below the median amount, single family homes, and percent of rental residences. And this is something that I'll go back and make sure there aren't additional variables that I should add, but those are the ones that I got from previous research that also use those variables. For my crime rate data, I acquired crime points from Denver City's website again. The data had every crime from 2013 to 2018 as a point location, and this was over 400,000 points. So to make that more digestible, I created 3 categories for crime per the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. And that's crime against persons, crime against property, and crime against society. And I just aggregated the total in each one of those categories per tract. And then with that, I omitted traffic violations that did not fall into the categories defined by the UCR. And then I broke up the data by year from 2014 or 13, 14, and 2018. And like I said, aggregated the data per census tract for each type of crime and the sum of crimes. And then in order to account for population change, I calculated crime rate per census tract as the number of crimes per 1,000 in population. So that'll account for any sort of population change. And then finally, for my dispensary location data, that was acquired from Denver City website open data catalog as well. The dispensary location data are based on active business licenses and their locations. The active license date was assumed as the establishment opening date. So that's one of the issues, I guess, with that data is just because they obtained that license doesn't mean that was the exact date it was open, but that's what I'll assume. The data needed to be geocoded from addresses to locations in my map, or XY locations. So I was able to acquire an address table from the Denver Open Data Catalog as well. And it relates every address in Denver to XY coordinates. It was a very large table, in case you're wondering. So I used that to geocode the locations in ARC. And I used a US single house address locator based on the address table, and that actually eliminated some duplicate locations. As I had mentioned, recreational and medical, 90% of them, of those dispensaries, are the same in the same place. So when I geocoded it, it actually got rid of some of those duplicates, which makes sense spatially. And then the data, again, were broken up by year and aggregated within each census tract by a spatial join. All right, we made it through data. My choropleth map. So I'll be using 3 different methods to analyze my data. First, I will use a choropleth map to visualize crime rate density and crime rate change density. This graphic is an example of how I did this for the same data sets in a previous class, Geog 586. On the left, you can see totals of crime per tract in 2013. And on the right, you can see total change in crime rate from 2013 to 2014 per tract. This is not statistically significant in any way. This just helped me understand where we're seeing densities in crime and also where there was change. So my second method, I'm first going to kind of go over spatial autocorrelation. So Tobler's first law of geography states that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. So spatial autocorrelation helps us understand the degree to which one object is similar to other nearby objects. And it's important because statistics relies on observations being independent from one another. If autocorrelation exists in a map, then this violates the fact that observations are independent from one another. So spatial autocorrelation measures how much close objects are in comparison with other close objects. And then Moran's eye measures spatial autocorrelation. And I'll be using a bivariate local Moran's eye for my spatial autocorrelation. So the Moran's eye can be classified as positive, negative, and no spatial autocorrelation. Positive spatial autocorrelation is when similar values cluster together in a map and negative spatial autocorrelation is when dissimilar values cluster together in a map. I will be analyzing the spatial autocorrelation of my data, and so therefore will be using a local indicators of spatial association, or LISA statistic. Moran's eye is a LISA statistic. So to measure the statistical significance of clusters is what I'll be using that for. In previous analysis of this data, I used a queen contiguity with an order contiguity of 1, and this accounted for all neighbors, including corner neighbors, for my census tract. Additionally, I used 999 permutations and a p-value significance of p is less than 0.05. Unless Fritz tells me I should do otherwise, because he's way smarter than me, I'll likely use this method again for this project, but again, I'm still doing research for my methodology to completely mark or get that down. So according to Luke Anselin, the creator of GeoDa, which is an awesome program, bivariate spatial correlation measures the degree to which the value for a given variable at a location is correlated with its neighbors for a different variable. So by using a bivariate local Moran's eye, I will have results depicting where each variable, crime rate in dispensaries, had the same pattern, that's high, high, low, low, or where there was significant variability, high, low, or low, high, and whether or not it was statistically significant. This graphic that you guys see here is an example of the results I obtained from Geography 586. My results could possibly look different for this research from the project I did in 586 because I'm using new variables and to weight my data and for aggregating the crime data. So I'll actually be doing this a little different, but I will probably still be using the same method for the bivariate local Moran's eye. So the third thing I will be doing is conducting an analysis of variance linear contrast test, which is essentially a special case of linear regression. However, I do not know a lot about this type of statistics and will be conducting research to better understand which type of ANOVA to use and why. This test will actually determine the statistical significance of my results over time. So like I said, I'll be using 2013 as the control year, since this was the last year before recreational marijuana dispensaries were legalized. And 2014, because this was the first year they were opened, and 2018, because it is the most recent year for data. I'll be using ArcGIS, have mostly been using ArcGIS. I know the program really well, and it's easy for me to run through and condition my data the way I need to. And then also I use that, like I said, for my, my geocoding. And then for the statistics portion of my project, I'll be using two programs. For the spatial autocorrelation, I'll be using GeoDa. And for the ANOVA linear contrast test, I'll likely be using R and RStudio. They're kind of the same thing. These two programs were created specifically for spatial or statistics, and then essentially focusing on spatial statistics as well, at least for GeoDa. The kind of things I'm gonna hit here is that for each one of these programs, I have to format my data differently for each one, of course. So that'll be something I'll have to get through, is figuring out how each one requires the formatting and then going through and doing that. So some of the challenges and limitations, most of what I'll be running into is just conditioning my data and figuring out which way to normalize it to make it better for my analysis. So one thing to keep in mind is the census data. I'm using 5-year estimates and not 10-year official counts. Some of my tracts have 0 population or have very few population because it's the airport, but have a lot of dispensaries. So these kind of outliers will have to be taken into account. And then only active business licenses are tracked in the dispensary data and not closing businesses. So if I wanted to figure out if that had any kind of impact on my analysis, I'd actually have to deal with the data manually. There's not anything I can pull any information for that. That'd just be some investigation I'd have to do. And then again, figuring out how to address the impact of MOP. So expected results, I'm actually not sure what I'm going to come up with. The reason for that is because my past research on this in Geog 586, I did have mixed results for that. Just doing the crime rate and dispensary locations, there was positive spatial autocorrelation, but crime rate change and the statistical significance of that was mixed. One year I saw some statistical significance, another year I did not. And then it just, I mean, each year was different. So there was no pattern for that. And then also in the previous research that I had done, there were mixed results as well. Like I said, half of them said there was positive correlation, some of them said there was not. So I'm not sure what to expect out of my results. I know I'll get results, just not sure exactly what they're going to say. So here is my project timeline. I would like to go to GIS in the Rockies. That's kind of my goal right now. So a lot of what I'll be doing is just finishing, conditioning my data, finalizing my methodology, analyzing my results and figuring out what those mean. The abstract is due July, I think 18th for GIS in the Rockies. And that's kind of the only conference on my agenda right now, just because my main goal is to graduate in December, and I couldn't really find any other conferences in the fall. So, and I won't be able to do any conferences this summer. So if I don't get in there, obviously my timeline will change, but if I do get in, then this is what it's looking like for me. And I think that's it. Are there any questions? Sorry, I'm pulling up the chat. Here it is. Sorry, oh, I should read that out loud. Sorry, Paul. He says, your approach is really thorough and definitely more sophisticated than studies I've seen. Is there any way to sort out whether crimes are committed against marijuana businesses, employees, and customers, or against local residents? I almost started typing in here. It's weird not having people around me. That is a really good question. Once I sorted out, I mean, I could look into the actual, like each point where there is a crime to see if it has any information in there. I mean, I'll be breaking them out into like property crime and crime against persons, but I don't know if there's really any specific way. Not saying there's not, but I don't know of any specific way to figure out if it's a crime specifically against the business or if it just happened in the area. Which is another limitation that I actually forgot to talk about, is that we don't know if these crimes are going to be, like, if someone, I don't know how to explain this. That's probably why I left it out. So one of the things people brought up in previous research was that if, and I'm not looking for any sort of causation, obviously, I'm just doing correlation, but something people had brought up was, if these businesses are causing crime, or how will we know that someone didn't just buy marijuana and then go out further to another location and cause some chaos? So that's, I mean, I'm not looking for causation, but understanding that the crime doesn't necessarily happen in the same location as the dispensary is something to keep in mind as well. Hopefully that made sense. Sorry, I'm a rambler.
Yeah, I have a question. This is Brandon. I was just curious, with actually no statistical analysis, is there already like preconceived notions in the Denver area if the legalization of marijuana has been good for society over the last 5 years, or is it still kind of like wishy-washy if it has actually been a good idea or not?
So that's been kind of the main discussion and argument, is that on one side, they're saying we're not seeing any change, we're not seeing any negative effects of this. And in those studies and in those arguments, it's from the census tract level and above when we're talking about the study area that they used. And that is not just in Denver, that was seen across the other areas where they did studies as well. And then at a finer, more, I guess, neighborhood level where it's a census block or smaller, the people doing the studies are saying, oh, there is some kind of correlation between them. And there is increased crime, but it's in adjacent areas and not specifically where exactly the business or the dispensary is located. So I guess that's one of the big why there's still a debate, because it depends on which study you look at. We're seeing it answered on both sides. And so I also saw that in a lot of the politicians who are speaking. Some are saying that it's good, some are saying that it's not. So, and that has a lot to do, there's, I guess, a lot more to it as well. If you're asking, like, economically, if it's been better, or for crime, and there's different answers for each of those kind of things. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thanks.
And then Chad said, will you be using a buffer for amount of crime from dispensaries? So I am not doing any, I'm not doing a buffer because I'm using census tract and I'm aggregating per census tract. So it'll be total dispensaries in a census tract as well as total crime in a census tract. But I have seen different regression methods used. I think Brooklyn, I don't know, like Constant did something, not with this kind of data, but a similar, where she used points for her regression and used a buffer. So it's something I definitely thought about, but for what I want to do, I think the census tract level is sufficient enough. Okay. Ron says, have you considered impact to population from a migration standpoint? He said, not long ago, I came across an article stating Denver had experienced growth since the date of legalization. I know you touched on census and demographics, but thought this might be interesting too. Yes, so I'm not necessarily looking at the impact of population. I'm taking population into consideration. And actually, one of the variables that I will be weighting from crime theory is that sort of movement of population and movement of people. Like, how long has someone been in a house? Are there rental properties there? What is the age of the people living there? Just because they saw in a lot of crime theories that a lot of movement in a neighborhood actually puts that area for is more vulnerable to crime. So it's understanding population movement, like people coming in and out, and rentals and all that kind of stuff, is something I'm taking into consideration for my variables, but not necessarily looking specifically at the impact.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions, Ashley.
Thank you. I guess I can like or something. Hold on, I'm slow.
Okay, so so that wraps it up for this evening. Tomorrow we still have many to go, but tomorrow we start at 11:30 and we have 4 presentations tomorrow. So I hope we'll see some of you back here then. And great job everybody tonight. And that wraps it up. Good night, everybody.
Hi, Beth. I got a question real quick. This is Brandon.
Yep.
I was just wondering, do you have a timeline on when the recorded presentations will be posted, just for some of us that are unable to participate in the other groups just because of time
Yeah,
zones and stuff.
I hope to have yesterday's and tonight's up shortly.
Okay.
Yeah, this one will take a little bit of time to process, and so in the meantime, I'll get the other one up there, but yeah, expect it tonight.
Okay. I just want to make sure I was like by the weekends I got some travel plans, so I want to make sure I provide the evaluations as soon as
Yes.
possible.
Yep.
All right,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
the question. Yep.